Whenever I suggest the BBC News is propaganda, people will get very dismissive and defensive. This is largely because the BBC itself is very good at pretending to be impartial, but people actually believe it. And in a world where channels like GB News exist or cable news channels in the US exist, the BBC is very good at making itself seem very composed and neutral in comparison. But there's still a bias there. They're just better at concealing it if you're not paying attention. So I saw this news broadcast a couple of weeks back. It's the 6 o'clock news from Tuesday, 16th of April. And I feel like it's such a perfect case study of a lot of the issues with the BBC and how it presents information in a propagandistic way. So let's break this thing down.
It's our top story this evening. MPs will.
So this is a report regarding the government ban on selling cigarettes to anyone born before 2009. The legislation passed, by the way. This is their report basically telling you why you should agree with the government when they pass this policy. Now, note the language they use. You know, the PM here talking about a smoke-free generation. On the surface, a very positive idea. You know, describing it off the bat as something that's not conservative.
Some Tory MPs have called it unconservative.
And that's an interesting choice of words. It alienates the Prime Minister from Conservative voters, but makes him and the policy seem more favourable to Liberals and people who consider themselves anti-conservative. Now, the report does a good job of trying to frame the idea of this ban as being part of a long history of progressive measures against smoking, using a narrator that sounds reassuring. And this little video package they put together, making smoking seem antiquated and talking about how smoking has gone from mainstream to marginal.
But smoking's been slowly wafting from the mainstream to the marginal.
To try and convince people that only a minority of people smoke, so it's almost as if this law doesn't matter. And they go further by trying to use clips that make smokers seem irrational. Now here's the important bit. You know, on this particular issue, whose voices are being heard? Whose voices are they amplifying? So in order to maintain their guise of impartiality, the BBC hears from both sides, but is selective not only in who they choose, but how long people speak, what clips they use, etc. So I talked to some young people who don't really say anything of substance in the clips used and aren't really given a chance to offer their views. So then they go straight to politicians in Parliament to let their voices be heard, presenting it as if all the parties are basically in favour of the issue. The BBC point to two of the exceptions, two of the people against the policy as the two former prime ministers who they themselves ran out of office with negative media campaigns. The idea, therefore, is to put in the mind of the viewer that the people against this policy don't have credibility because Boris and Liz Truss are also against it. Then you get them pushing the same anti-smoking rhetoric we've all heard a million times. Did you know that smoking kills? And then we get to the real central point to hammer it home, how much smokers cost the taxpayer in terms of NHS costs. And so this is the main propaganda point being used by both the BBC and the government, focusing on this number where they're basically trying to blame the slowly dying NHS on individuals with bad health instead of successive Tory governments that have been starving it. And look, I'm not a smoker myself. I've never smoked in my life, tobacco anyway, but I'm also personally not the biggest fan of this policy because it's very clearly the Tories trying to escape responsibility, avoid giving the NHS the funding it needs. And the BBC is clearly complicit in this, talking positively about this and other terrible Tory initiatives like the sugar tax. You know, whatever side of the issue you're on, you need to accept the fact that the BBC clearly has a bias here, whether you agree with that bias or not. Anti-smoking rhetoric is propaganda, even if it's positive propaganda for the sake of public health. And the BBC is a vehicle for that propaganda. It's trying to get you to consent to government policy by telling you it's a good thing. One thing I also picked up on with this news reporting, something I never thought about before because of how rarely I watch the news anymore, is the lack of sources. So they'll just say something like some figure or talk about a study, but never offer citations, not even what institution did the study, when it was done, or anything like that. And I think this isn't just a BBC thing. This is very much a television news thing. It's a very common thing with TV news where they're just supposed to take what they say at face value. And there's a real pacifying nature to the presentation, BBC especially. When you're British and you've grown up learning to trust the BBC and the information it gives you with the familiar graphics, the music presenters, you're less likely to try and challenge or critique it. And though younger people don't watch as much TV news, older people still do. And so it's still a problem that they're just accepting what they're told. So the next story was about a school in North London that banned Muslim students from being allowed to pray at school and how this was backed up by the British courts. Now, this is very much an Islamophobic policy. There's no getting around that. Muslims, of course, pray in a very specific way that's different to Christians or others, and they should be allowed to do that if they want to. And this report is the BBC pretty much justifying this policy. Of course, they do try to make a show of trying to get both sides, but again, see how they're presenting the two sides. On the one side, we get a disembodied quote from the mother of a student who was prevented from praying. And we also get this random imam showing up on a Zoom call. You know, all the imams that probably live a short driving distance from the BBC News studio, they can just call one up and be like, hey, you want to do a proper interview? It's just this random guy who gets to talk for 5 seconds. So how do they represent the other side? So they present the school as neat and orderly, the head teacher as friendly and strict, which in old people language is typically a good thing for teachers to be. And then they give a proper sit-down interview with the notoriously bigoted former Home Secretary because she happens to be a former school governor. And they give this coconut a platform to spout her jingoistic rhetoric completely unchallenged. This is the order of what happens. They present the basic facts of the issue with images of how great the school is. Then they present the case of the mother, and then this prat comes on the screen and starts ranting about my British values, and then the imam shows up to spend far less time to get in a quick word about how praying is important for Muslims, and then the segment ends. And this is the problem with TV news. There's very little analysis of the situation. There's no attempt to dive even a little deeper beyond a very superficial narrative. But it's not like they aren't also telling us how to think about a situation, how to feel about it. And they're doing this through the images they use, the language they use, the sources they selectively choose to present. And again, this isn't a BBC-specific problem. It's a problem with all TV news, where the BBC is just as culpable as something like a Fox News in telling you what to think about a situation. The next report was about people out of work in the UK, with a specific focus on disabled people not being employed. Now, this report is done very tactfully, so it can be hard to see the propaganda if you're not paying attention. If you understand first and foremost that the BBC's audience is going to be primarily made up of people who aren't disabled and will likely have some ingrained ableist sentiments, then you can see how some of the elements of this report play on that reality. And when I say the audience has some ableist views, I don't mean to say that they're all bad, horrible people. I mean that in the society we live in, culture has imposed on us a lot of ableist views and reactionary assumptions about disabled people. It doesn't mean we're all frothing at the mouth whenever we see someone in a wheelchair, but that we're conditioned to believe in some very harmful things about disabled people, most commonly that they're faking or they're overly dramatic or perhaps that they're somehow an inconvenience for other people. And these are things that we learn and we have to unlearn, but I digress. So I start the report talking to a person with unseen disabilities, mental disabilities, which are often dismissed by the general public a little bit more than physical disabilities. Now, the person they're interviewing is a very normal-looking, conventionally attractive person, and they're also very well-spoken. Now, these are usually qualities that can help people plead their case in a society that values these arbitrary constructs, but when it comes to something like disability, these are qualities that can harm your case. For people who are less convinced by the idea that mental disabilities exist, for instance, maybe they've heard the propaganda that these people are faking and these are just young people who don't want to look for work. They'll be less convinced that somebody who looks like this has some sort of unseen disability. They'll see someone like this, hear them talk about the situation and say, oh, there's nothing wrong with you. And this might seem like a contradiction, that they need some sort of visual evidence to prove to them that they are looking at someone who is disabled in an unseen way. And you'd be correct. It is a contradiction, but people are conditioned to think in very contradictory ways. Then they start talking to someone who is older and who says they have a disability that they developed after contracting COVID-19. And the news reporter's narration says this is quite common. And yes, I've heard about this personally from people I know who have gotten COVID. Long COVID is very much a thing, because COVID shit is scary. But again, this is also largely unseen, but because this person is a visibly older person, I think this might sway some people in the audience into believing them a little bit more, though it's hard to get in the mind of a Tory voter sometimes, so it depends. I don't know what is going on in their heads. But here's the important bit of this person's interview. They say they can't go back to work, that they miss working and want to go back to work. I don't doubt that for a minute. People like working, people want to be productive in some way, and we can question whether we should all be working at the behest of some capitalist class, but we all want to be doing something, right? This idea that disabled people are just lazy is harmful, or saying anyone out of work is lazy is harmful. Now, I think people will look at how I presented these two interviews and find my arguments unconvincing, that I'm reading into it or something, that, being hypercritical. But let me get to the conclusion of this BBC report, and you'll understand where I'm coming from. Because they conclude the report by talking about the £50 billion in benefits the government apparently pays. So the BBC frames it as ordinary taxpayers collectively paying £50 billion. Obviously, this is them portraying disability benefits negatively. They're trying to tell you that you personally are paying money to other people with disabilities and trying to portray that as a negative, like disabled people are reaching into your wallets and taking the money. And, that is classic propaganda. Then the reporter starts talking about how the government is going to get disabled people back into work so they no longer receive any benefits, which conversely to the other point is trying to make you think, oh, that's a good thing. The government's going to help me by taking money away from disabled people, right? So when you complement this with the NHS thing, and you see that this is another report about a government policy to try and avoid a necessary area of spending. They want to try and reduce disability benefits for all these people who need it, and the BBC have very successfully constructed a report that makes this seem like a good thing. They're framing it as the government trying to help people get into work, and anyone not in that situation will just react passively. The reality of that situation for anyone who hasn't had to interact with the DWP or hasn't ever been to a Job Centre Plus, you don't know that the people who work these places, they don't really want to help you. They're just basically trained to try and force you into some kind of shitty menial labour job. And the BBC doesn't explore this at all. There's no attempt to critique or analyse this government scheme. The report is just trying to get its audience to be complacent, to trust in the British government, and to have disdain for disabled people and people on benefit. It's trying to concoct a consent within the general public for this government policy. So, after this, we have the international section, because the next section of the new show is about Palestine. So this should be fun. First, talking about how EasyJet is suspending all flights in and out of Israel, and then talking about the, quote, spiraling violence in the West Bank, which makes it sound like there's something inherently wrong with the West Bank instead of it being an active invasion effort by Israeli terrorists. The BBC reports the violence as the result of a rising tension because Iran attacked. And this report follows the Iranian retaliation against Israel following Israel attacking an Iranian consulate without provocation. And it's funny how they twisted things again. So this report follows the Iranian retaliation against Israel following Israel attacking an Iranian consulate without provocation. And it's funny how they've twisted things again. Before it was Israel versus Hamas. Now the conflict is Israel versus, quote, Iranian-backed groups. The entire Western media has spent the better part of 50 years pushing propaganda about Iran and how evil it is because it wouldn't play ball with American imperialists and oil barons. The BBC is included in this propaganda campaign. And look, I don't think Iran is great, obviously. It is very much a theocratic state, but I don't think it's evil. I think that overly mystifies the problems with Iran. There's no inherent, satanic nature to this country, but so much of Western propaganda about the place relies on you believing there is some sort of demonic thing going on over there, right? And it's this sort of rhetoric that it helps sell the reality that the BBC is trying to invent here, trying to get you to think that somehow the violence in Palestine is the result of Iran and not because of the violent settler colonialists who have been illegally occupying the country for the better part of a century and sporadically murdering Palestinians whenever they feel like it. They're acting like Israelis haven't been actively sending terrorist militias into the West Bank to forcibly evict Palestinians from their homes and take it over. But I digress. So they go on to just platform genocidal maniac Benjamin Netanyahu, spreading more of his propaganda without any critique or opposing views whatsoever. Very, very fair and balanced. Seriously, there's no Hamas leaders interviewed, no Iranian figures interviewed, no academic experts interviewed. Not even any Palestinian families, just some bastard murdering innocent people, and a former foreign minister fear-mongering about how the West is next if they don't stop Iran. And this is probably the most overt propaganda piece, the BBC echoing current British state foreign policy, and it's really fucking disgusting. So, moving on from that, next they did a report about how the people in Copenhagen are upset about a building burning down. Not much to say here. It's not really a real nothing story. Maybe it means more if you're Danish. I don't know. But that is followed up by a report about a far-right conference in Brussels, the National Conservative Conference, and how the, quote, local socialist mayor is trying to shut it down, which, big dog whistle right there. Oh no, the socialists are cancelling the fascists. How dare they? And it's so, this is also so fucking overt, this report. They let British fascist Nigel Farage speak without critique, and like with Israel earlier, there's no opposing views. It's just Nigel Farage being angry about being shut down and him saying how they were doing nothing wrong. They said it was the mayor of Brussels who did this, but they never say his name or party. They never give him an interview or anyone from his office an interview. It's very one-sided in favor of literal fascists, which is insane. They do a little bit of their fair and balanced song and dance when asking, was this silencing free speech or protecting people from extremist ideology? And considering they never actually show people what was being said at the conference or present any opposing views, they just show pictures of imposing policemen blocking entrances, which, I don't know, kind of speaks to me about which side the BBC are on in this situation. And then they end the report that this situation was good publicity for the conference, trying to present it as the conference as having a big win.
As one organiser put it, you can't buy publicity like this.
Which, I guess they're helping with the publicity as well, considering that the BBC themselves are basically promoting the organisation here, which is weird. These people rarely talk about shit going on in Belgium, but apparently they had reporters following Nigel Farage and Suella Braverman there. If that's who they're documenting, oh, okay. So this was then followed by a short Trump segment about Trump's trial, and they just let him speak for himself. Though in this case, it works because anytime this guy opens his mouth, he undermines himself to the British audience anyway. No one here takes anything he says seriously. Everyone thinks he's a clown. So they moved away from the actual news at this point to talk about some shit that doesn't matter, like most news shows. First was their Olympic circle jerk. Oh my God, the Olympics, you guys, so cool, so amazing. A country just spent billions of taxpayers' money to line the pockets of multinational corporations, so cool. So this report was focused on a specific Olympic swimmer, Adam Peaty, specifically focused on him being a born-again Christian. And, okay, look, so no offense to Christians or religious people of any kind. I got nothing against you personally. Only the bishops and clerics and also the religious propaganda like this report. Look, this guy seems nice enough, but does this shit really need to be on the 6 o'clock news? Do we need someone talking about how God saved him or whatever and how his faith helps him swim? What is this? Considering several reports ago they were shaming Muslims for wanting to pray in schools, this is really fucking weird, and it does speak to an attempt by the ruling powers to try and revive Christianity in Britain, a country that has become increasingly secular in the last few decades. The interviewer then asks the dumbest question.
How does it work on a daily basis in terms of going to church and fitting it in with swimming?
Ah, yes. Everyone knows that the 5th commandment is, thou shalt not swim. The fuck are you talking about? It sounds like the sort of shit you hear in weird Christian movies and stuff. It's very weird. So after that nonsense, they talk about the seagulls and some flooding in Dubai, and then it's the UK weather, and then it's the end of the show, unless you want to watch the local news, but I can't be fucked with that. Okay, now, what is my thesis statement here? Now, obviously, I'm just looking at one single news broadcast here. It's not really a good sample size to just condemn the whole BBC. My original plan was to talk about a week's worth of 6 o'clock news broadcasts, but I had so much to say about this one. So I guess my main point here is that the BBC is not infallible. In fact, it is very fallible. And that's something that should be critiqued and challenged, especially when the propaganda it's pushing is harmful, when it's justifying horrible political policies, including government austerity, when it's pushing a right-wing nationalist agenda, when it's helping the propaganda war surrounding a literal genocide. This shit ain't fair and balanced. It serves a very specific agenda. And I want to look more into this over time to try and figure out what this agenda is, whose agenda it is. There's something very powerful about news broadcasting because people accept what they're told here at face value. And with the BBC especially, there's a sense that they have a monopoly on truth. But the reality is they're helping construct a conception of the truth that doesn't serve your interests, but it serves someone else's interests. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. I want to talk more about BBC propaganda in the future, so if you can think of any specific reports or programs I should cover, let me know in the comments down below. Thanks again.